Right, so welcome to another deep dive. You ready to tackle some big questions today?
Well, always. What are we diving into this time?
Well, today's deep dive is all about a question that I think everyone asks themselves at some point. Why believe in God?
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah, it is. And we're going to explore it from some pretty interesting angles. We're going to be looking at excerpts from a text called Why Believe in God, which presents a perspective from the Quran.
Okay.
But we're also going to be looking at some common atheist arguments.
Yeah.
So it's going to be like this blend of philosophy, theology.
And a bit of social commentary, too,
Yeah,
preferably.
exactly. I think this will be a really engaging deep dive for anyone who's ever thought about this question.
I agree. I'm excited to get into it.
So let's jump right in. One of the biggest challenges to the idea of a benevolent God is, well, the problem of evil. If God is all good and all powerful, why is there so much suffering in the world? I mean, the text we're looking at doesn't shy away from this at all. It brings up some really tough examples like bone cancer in children or parasites that can cause blindness. It's hard to ignore those realities, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The problem of evil is one of the most persistent challenges to traditional theism.
Right.
And I think those examples you mentioned really highlight the emotional weight of the issue.
Yeah, for sure. So, how does the text we're looking at approach this? Does it offer any answers?
It does, but it approaches it from a different angle than you might expect. It challenges the assumption that God is directly creating evil.
Interesting. So it's not like God is actively causing these terrible things to happen.
Right. Instead, it suggests that maybe suffering is an inevitable consequence of human choices and actions.
So more like we humans are messing things up and then blaming God for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. We have a tendency to want to find someone or something to blame when things go wrong, especially when it comes to suffering on a large scale.
Yeah, it's easier to point the finger at God than to face the possibility that we might be responsible for some of the pain in the world.
And the text backs this up with some really interesting examples. It points to major historical events where human decisions, not divine intervention, led to widespread suffering.
Oh, like what?
Well, for example, the sinking of the Titanic. There's actually conspiracy theory that it was all an insurance
Yeah,
scam.
seriously, that's a whole other deep dive right there. But I see your point. We're quick to look for supernatural explanations when sometimes the answer might be a lot more human and, well, messy.
Exactly. And it's not just the Titanic. The text also mentions the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Bhopal disaster in India, the Irish potato famine, all devastating events that can be traced back to human choices.
That's a lot to think about. So it seems like this text is shifting the focus from God causing suffering to humans being responsible for it. But that raises another question for me. If that's the case, then what about accountability?
I was just thinking the same thing.
Right. If there's no divine punishment looming over our heads, why bother being good? Why not just do whatever we want?
Well, that's where the text makes a really fascinating connection between belief in God and the idea of accountability.
Okay, tell me more.
It suggests that believing in a higher power, especially a higher power that embodies goodness and justice, can foster a sense of responsibility for our actions.
So it's not about fear of punishment, but about wanting to do what's right because we believe someone is watching, someone who represents a higher standard of good.
Exactly. It's about aligning our own actions with that higher standard. It's like having an internal compass that's always pointing us towards ethical behavior.
I can see how that could be a powerful motivator, but couldn't you argue that people can be moral without believing in God?
Absolutely. There are plenty of atheists who live ethical and fulfilling lives. But the text challenges us to think about why even intelligent, educated people can engage in corrupt or harmful behavior. If laws and education are enough to guide us toward ethical choices, why do we still see so much wrongdoing in the world?
I see what you're saying. It seems like there's something more at play than just rules and knowledge. Like maybe we need something deeper, something more foundational to really anchor our moral compass.
Right, and that's where the idea of belief in God, as presented in this text, comes in.
Okay, this is all making me think about something else. You know how some atheists demand concrete proof of God's existence before they'll even consider these ideas?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic challenge.
So how does this text address that? Does it offer any scientific evidence or anything like that?
Well, it doesn't offer any scientific evidence in the traditional sense, but it does something really interesting. It turns the whole idea of proof on its head.
How so?
It asks, do we really need absolute, undeniable proof for everything we believe? Do we count every star in the sky to accept that there are billions? Do we insist on meeting historical figures face to face to believe they existed?
No, of course not. We rely on a combination of evidence, logic, and trust in established knowledge.
Exactly. And the text suggests that maybe our approach to belief in God should be similar.
So it's not about demanding absolute certainty, but about gathering the evidence, whether from personal experiences, philosophical arguments, or religious texts, and then drawing our own conclusions based on what we find most compelling.
Right. It's about approaching the question with an open mind and a willingness to consider different perspectives.
And you know what? I'm starting to wonder if having undeniable proof of God would actually be a good thing. Wouldn't that kind of eliminate free will?
That's a profound point. The text actually touches on that. It suggests that if God's existence were an undeniable fact, our choices would be driven more by fear of judgment than by genuine conviction.
It's like if we knew for sure that God was watching our every move, would we really be free in our choices, or would we just be acting out of
Which
self-preservation?
is a question that really makes you think about the nature of faith and free will.
And it reminds me of that analogy the text uses, comparing our understanding of God to a tiny fruit fly trying to comprehend Einstein's theory of relativity.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
It's like maybe we're just those fruit flies buzzing around trying to make sense of something that's far grander than we can currently grasp. It's humbling, to say the least.
It is, and it reminds us that there might be aspects of the divine that are simply beyond our current capacity to understand.
Well, I think this has been a great starting point for our deep dive. We've tackled some tough questions about suffering, accountability, and the very nature of proof itself. And we've only just begun to explore the Quran's perspective on this whole question of why believe in God.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to unpack.
Definitely. In the next part of our deep dive, I want to delve deeper into the Quran's specific descriptions of God's attributes. I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Me too. There's a lot to uncover there,
Mhm.
and I think it will shed even more light on the question of why believe in God.
Sounds good. Let's take a break and come back for part two. All right, we're back for part two of our deep dive into why believe in God. We've already uncovered some pretty thought-provoking stuff, like how human actions contribute to suffering and that fruit fly analogy.
Yeah, that one really stuck with me.
Me too. It really highlights how limited our understanding of God might be. But now I'm excited to shift gears a bit and explore how the Quran actually describes God. You mentioned earlier that it emphasizes God's oneness and uniqueness.
It does. It's one of the most fundamental concepts in the Quran.
So what does that actually mean? What does it look like to believe in a God that's completely one of a kind?
Well, for starters, the Quran uses the Arabic word ahad to describe God's oneness. And this means there's only one God, not multiple gods or deities like you see in some other belief systems.
So no Zeus, no Thor, no pantheon of gods to choose from, just one singular, all-encompassing God.
Exactly. And this oneness is directly related to another key attribute of God, samad.
Samad, what does that mean?
It's a complex concept, but essentially it means self-sufficient or independent action. God doesn't rely on anything or anyone else. God is complete in and of itself.
That's pretty different from the image of a God who demands sacrifices or constant worship.
Right. It challenges that transactional view of the divine. It suggests that God isn't some needy being who requires our constant attention and appeasement.
So if God is self-sufficient, why do we even need to believe in God? What's the point?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what the Quran is trying to convey. It's not about fulfilling God's needs. It's about transforming our own lives and aligning ourselves with a higher purpose.
Okay, I'm following you. But there's another attribute you mentioned earlier. God is not begotten or begetting. What does that mean?
It means God has no children and wasn't born from anything. This further emphasizes God's uniqueness and absolute nature. It sets God apart from any other being.
So no divine family tree or complicated genealogies to keep track of?
Nope. The Quran presents a concept of God that's far more abstract and transcendent than that.
I see. But here's a question that's probably on our listeners' minds. If God is so unique and abstract, how do we even relate to that? I mean, a lot of people find comfort in the idea of a personal God, someone they can pray to and feel a connection with.
That's a great question. And the Quran doesn't deny the possibility of a personal relationship with God. It's more about recognizing the limitations of our human understanding.
You mean like how we were talking about with the fruit fly?
Exactly. We might be trying to grasp something that's ultimately beyond our full comprehension. Think about it this way. We can experience the effects of gravity, but can we fully comprehend what gravity is?
That's a good point. So maybe it's the same with God. We can experience God's presence in our lives, but fully grasping the entirety of what God is might be beyond our current capacity.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it?
It is. But then how do we make sense of the Quran's claims about God if we can't fully understand them?
Well, the Quran acknowledges this challenge. It encourages investigation and contemplation, but emphasizes that our understanding is always going to be evolving and imperfect.
So it's like we're on this journey of understanding and we might never reach the final destination.
Exactly. It's a lifelong process of learning, growing, and deepening our connection with the divine.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about how the Quran describes God as one, self-sufficient, and unlike anything else in existence. But how does all of this connect back to the core question? Why believe in God?
Well, one of the key arguments presented in the text is that belief in God, as understood through the Quran, leads to a more ethical and fulfilling life. It's about aligning ourselves with those permanent values that the Quran emphasizes.
Permanent values. What are those?
They're ethical principles that the Quran highlights as being essential for a meaningful life. Things like honesty, compassion, justice, generosity.
Okay, so those sound like pretty universal values, but why does the Quran call them permanent?
Because it argues that these values are not arbitrary or culturally specific. They're woven into the very fabric of creation, reflecting the very nature of God. They're like universal principles that transcend time and culture.
So by striving to embody these values, we're aligning ourselves with something bigger than ourselves. We're tapping into a cosmic order that leads to a more harmonious world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our actions have consequences, not just in this life, but potentially in the next as well.
That brings us back to the idea of accountability that we talked about earlier. Believing in a God who embodies these permanent values might inspire us to strive towards them in our own lives. But what about the people who don't believe? Does the text address how those who don't subscribe to this worldview should live their lives?
That's a fascinating question, and it leads us into a discussion about the Quran's perspective on the relationship between belief and action. We'll dive into that in the final part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into why believe in God. We've been exploring this idea from all angles: atheist arguments, the Quran's perspective, those permanent values. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it all comes together in a really fascinating way when we start looking at how the Quran connects belief to actions, especially in light of the afterlife.
Okay, yeah, that's where we left off, right? A lot of people wonder, what's the point of being good if there's no ultimate payoff? Does the Quran address that?
It definitely does. The Quran talks a lot about the afterlife, about a kind of reckoning where our actions in this life are judged. But it's not just about following rules to avoid punishment. It's about understanding that our choices have consequences that go way beyond our time on Earth.
So like a cosmic cause and effect kind of thing, what we do here echoes into eternity.
Exactly. And that awareness can be a powerful motivator for living ethically, for really striving to embody those permanent values we discussed.
I can see that. Knowing that our actions have this eternal weight might make us think twice before making selfish or harmful choices. But what about people who don't believe in an afterlife? Does the Quran say their actions don't matter as much?
Actually, that's where the Quran gets really interesting. It emphasizes the importance of intention, even if someone doesn't believe in a traditional afterlife. If their actions are driven by genuine goodness, by a desire to make a positive impact, the Quran suggests those actions still hold value.
So it's not just about ticking boxes in a specific belief system, but about the heart behind our choices.
That's a great way to put it. The Quran seems to be saying that genuine goodness, regardless of where it comes from, has inherent worth. It's about aligning ourselves with those universal principles of justice, compassion, and kindness.
That's a pretty powerful message. It suggests the Quran isn't just about rewards and punishments after we die. It's about cultivating a way of life that benefits everyone, both now and in the future.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, understanding that our actions have ripple effects that go way beyond our immediate sphere. Even small acts of kindness can contribute to a greater good.
It's like we're all part of this grand tapestry, and our choices determine the patterns we weave into it. Whether we believe in a specific afterlife or not, our actions matter.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. And I think it speaks to the heart of what this text is trying to convey. The question, why believe in God, isn't just a theoretical exercise. It's a call to action. It's an invitation to align ourselves with something larger than ourselves, to strive for a more just and compassionate world.
I love that. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and making choices that uplift not just ourselves, but everyone around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think this has been an incredible deep dive. We've tackled some really complex ideas about suffering, accountability, the nature of God, and the impact of our actions. I know I've learned a lot.
Me too. It's been a fascinating journey through philosophy, theology, and even a bit of social commentary.
And to our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has sparked some new thoughts, maybe even challenged some old assumptions.
Remember, the search for meaning is a journey, not a destination. Keep asking those tough questions, keep exploring different perspectives, and keep those deep dives going.
Until next time.